Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and today I want to talk about Star Trek Lower Decks, which will be released next month. This new show is being made by the creators of Rick and Morty, and I do kind of like that show, so if this new Star Trek animated show will have the same kind of creativity, if it has the same kind of humor, then maybe I will enjoy it. It all depends also on what age exactly are they targeting, because Rick and Morty has some pretty, nasty humor, all kinds of adult jokes, a lot of gory stuff, a lot of outrageous stuff that would be funny, and I'm not sure that's how they will do it in this new show, and I'm not even sure it's a good idea in the Star Trek universe, because I always say Star Trek used to be so positive. It used to be one of the only science fiction franchises which actually showed us a bright future in which humanity got enlightened and got better and all of that. That's one of the main parts of the vision of Gene Roddenberry, and so I'm not sure that kind of humor like in Rick and Morty would fit in the Star Trek universe. On the other hand, I do kind of enjoy it in Rick and Morty, and so that's why I have some mixed feelings. I guess we'll wait and see. And also, just as an adult, you don't really enjoy the same kind of jokes you did as a kid, and so I'm not sure I would enjoy it simply because I'm too old for that. Possibly, it all depends on how they do it. If it's like Rick and Morty, I probably would enjoy it, and also, I watch Star Trek for the science fiction ideas, and Rick and Morty did have a lot of interesting and creative science fiction stuff, and so if they have the same kind of creativity in this new show, maybe it will finally feel fresh and interesting, and so I'm not going to judge this show before I see it, and I do hope it will be good. I really hope to finally see a good Star Trek show. Now, there are a lot of open questions about it. What time period will it be set in? It kind of looks like it will be around the TNG era. The ship looks very similar to the Galaxy class, the Enterprise D, and the uniforms look similar to that time period, and yet not exactly the same. So if they will say it is in that time period, then I will be annoyed that they are not following continuity properly, that they still have to make some kind of change. And the uniforms look kind of like a cross between the TOS movie era and the TNG era. So maybe this is set before TNG, maybe before those uniforms of season 1, and that's why they have that zipper that looks kind of similar to the uniforms that came before that in the movies. So that might be an interesting era to set it in, because that actually had some pretty big window of time between the shows that was never really explored. The era right after the Enterprise C, in which they still had those uniforms of the movies, and so this is set somewhere after that, around 2 decades before TNG. This might be interesting. Also, they could show us like maybe the early holodeck, which could still be glitchy and stuff. And the holodeck of season 1 of TNG worked really differently from the ones that we saw later. I made theory videos about this to explain away all the contradictions. I said they changed the way it works. So this might be an opportunity to show all kinds of technology in its early stages, even the replicators, which did not actually exist in the time of TOS. They had the food slots, but those were not actually replicators. So if they could show like an early replicator which is glitchy and an early holodeck which is glitchy, this would fit right in with the setup of the show, which is about the junior officers, the lower decks, the crew behind the scenes which are working on the technical stuff on the ship, trying to make it all work. And so that's why I kind of hope this is when the show is set in. And if it's set during TNG itself, it might also be interesting, because they could show us like stuff that happened in that universe from a different point of view. Like maybe this was one of the ships that was at Wolf 359 and managed to escape. I think they said that one ship escaped that battle, that there were 40 ships at that battle, and 39 of them were destroyed, and only one ship escaped, which I don't think we ever heard which exact ship that was. And so this might be a cool way to tie this show to TNG by saying that maybe this ship was at that battle at some point and escaped. And so it might be interesting as well, even though it has the risk of messing things up and to kind of ruin continuity if they don't do it right. But if it's done right, it might be interesting. But of course, the uniform thing makes me wish it's not set exactly at TNG time, because then I would ask why are the uniforms not exactly the same as in the rest of the fleet that we saw. Or maybe the show will be set after Voyager, and then continuity will be more open to interpretation. They could do a lot more stuff without violating anything, so in that sense it might be a better idea. But specifically because of the technology thing, I think it would be a better idea would be to set it before TNG, because that will allow them to show kind of more glitchy technology. in its early stages, and so that's why I kind of wish that's the era it's set in, and that would also explain the uniforms, why it's kind of a mix between the TNG uniform and the TOS movie uniforms. And as for the ship itself, we have an image of it, and I have some mixed feelings on it. On the one hand, it's obviously very similar to the Enterprise D, the Galaxy class. The saucer looks almost exactly the same. And that's actually the kind of ships that are my personal favorite. I think that was the best era of Star Trek in many ways, and also in the ship designs itself. I think the ships of that era, the TNG ships, were the most beautiful visually. They were very kind of clean, they were sleek and smooth, and they were beautiful. Even though some of the later ships might have looked cooler and more powerful and all of that, but the TNG era ships simply, there was something special in that. Maybe I'm biased because I grew up on TNG. That was my introduction to Star Trek, and so that's my personal favorite. So I kind of like the fact that this new ship looks very similar to that. The biggest flaw in this design is obviously that the drive section seems to have like a part missing, like nothing is connecting the saucer to the engineering section, and the only way to get from the saucer into the drive section is to go through the nacelles, through those pylons that hold the nacelles, and they don't seem to have like a lot of room inside it. So are there turbo lifts inside there or what, or are they just using the transporters? So all of this seems a little bit fishy. Now, it might be explained in the show itself. It also depends on the style of humor they're going to do. If they're going to show that the whole ship is glitchy and that it's badly designed, and that will be part of the plot, part of the fun of it, part of the comedy, then I guess it will make sense. You know, the show probably is not going to take itself too seriously, so maybe they're doing some silly stuff deliberately, and it will be part of the joke, and then I'll be fine with that. And maybe they will give a proper explanation for that. Maybe there's some kind of purpose for that. I actually think this kind of design maybe would have been fine if they set it up in Star Trek from the first place. I actually think the reason they had the nacelles as kind of a separate thing from the rest of the ship originally is because maybe they were thinking like maybe this is highly radioactive, maybe it poses a danger to the crew, and that's why you have to keep the crew away from the engineering section, away from the main reactor and the nacelles, because they're so radioactive, they will irradiate the crew, and that's why you need to have that distance between the nacelles and the rest of the ship. So maybe they're going with a similar kind of logic here, keeping all that stuff away from the habited area of the ship, and maybe the ship will have the ability to separate easier than the Enterprise D did. Maybe they keep 99% of the crew only on the saucer, and only this new crew of the lower decks, basically they will be the one working on the lower section, and so maybe they will be feeling discriminated against and stuff like that. And maybe they will be complaining about the dangers, and maybe at the first sign of danger the saucer will separate and fly away and leave them alone on the drive section. And so there's a lot of possibilities of how they can play with this, and if they do, then maybe it will justify this design. So maybe this is meant to enable the saucer to separate more easily from the drive section, and maybe they'll even have some new abilities. Maybe the saucer will be able to land on planets, and the engine will remain in space. Now, in this footage, we actually see that the arrow is pointing to the saucer, as if they are working on the bottom part and the behind of the saucer, and not in that drive section itself, but maybe they'll be going down there constantly, maybe beam over or go through space. Maybe they'll make a joke of the fact that they don't have a turbo lift to take them there because the ship is so badly designed. So again, I think if it will be part of the humor of the show, that the ship is messed up because of stupidity, then it might work. Even though if they go that route, then I wouldn't really consider any of what's happening in the show as canon, if it's going to be like a total silly comedy. Now, as for these new characters, it's really too early to judge, but based on these snapshots of them that we see, it looks like they're once again aiming at today's youth, I guess, because some of these characters have these new kinds of haircuts of, you know, part of the head being shaved, or the hair being dyed, and all kinds of stuff like that. They did similar stuff with the minor characters of Discovery, but you know, my biggest problem with Discovery is that they didn't develop any of those minor characters. We didn't know anything about any of them until maybe in season 2 they did that a little bit, but in season 1 they were just in the background. So their look doesn't really matter that much. What matters is how well they develop them. And that guy with that thing on his eye, I guess he's kind of supposed to be similar to Geordi LaForge, so maybe he has a problem with that eye, maybe he had an injury, or maybe it's simply something to help him in his job, so we don't know yet. When I saw that kind of stuff in Discovery, I said this is one of the many reasons that show should have been set after Voyager, and then they could simply say all those people with the strange mechanical stuff in their heads, they could have simply said they are former Borg drones, and that would make them cool, kind of like 7 of 9. But instead, no, it was in the past before TOS, and yet they had all this cybernetic stuff. And if this show is indeed set before TNG, and yet people have that kind of stuff, that will be not a violation of continuity, but that will kind of raise question marks. And the fact that we never saw that kind of stuff in TNG itself, except for Geordi LaForge, of course. But if they have too much of that kind of stuff, that will kind of irritate me a little bit, probably, especially if they provide no explanation for that. And of course, the unique thing about this show is that it's going to be focused on these junior officers and not on the bridge crew of the ship, which I have mixed feelings on. And this is an opportunity also to mention the TNG episode Lower Decks, which had a similar kind of setup. That episode was just about the junior officers, all the newbies, all the new guys on the ship. And of course, Nurse Ogawa, who was kind of a semi-regular, she appeared often even before that episode. And that Bajoran chick appeared in an episode with Wesley Crusher in the Academy. And one of the guys was a waiter, and we saw those kinds of waiters all the time. And you know, I remember the first time I saw that episode, I actually didn't like it. When I saw it as a kid, I remember disliking that episode because maybe simply because I love the usual TNG episode so much. I love the main cast, the main crew, the bridge crew, and the normal stories. I love them so much. And when that episode appeared, and suddenly we barely see any of the bridge crew, and we see these new guys, and not a lot of stuff happened in that episode. It was just about their daily life and no bigger story at all. I remember finding that episode really boring and really annoying because I kept waiting, where is Data, where is Picard, where are my favorite characters, and suddenly I'm forced to watch some totally different characters. And so I actually remember disliking that episode. But of course, in retrospect, that is a very interesting episode because it shakes things up, and it gives us a glimpse of the other people on the ship, which normally they rarely did. And so in that way, it was kind of a fresh episode. And also they did a very good job of introducing these new characters and making us care about them and all of that. It's really unfortunate that they didn't really do anything with them later, except for Ogawa, who appeared once in a while, but all the other ones basically disappeared. And I think that was a missed opportunity, and maybe they should have done something like that early on in the series, and then have these characters pop up once in a while, and then we'll care about them a lot more. You know, if one of them dies, then we'll care. And so when I think about that episode now, I do find it very interesting, and also it's ironic how in one episode they managed to do much better character development than they did in Star Trek Discovery in an entire season. We barely got to know any of those minor characters on the bridge, and yet in one episode of TNG, they did a very good job of getting to know so many new characters, and it was just for a one-time thing. So I guess it depends on how well they make it. If they make this new crew lovable and likable and interesting, then they can carry the show. They can be the ones that we follow and the ones we like and all of that. It doesn't have to be the main bridge crew. It can still be an interesting show if it's focused on the junior officers. Now, the big problem is that this way maybe we won't really see a lot of bigger stories. We won't really see the decision-making process of the ship. We won't know where the ship is going, what it's doing. We'll only see it all from the eyes of these junior officers. And this might be annoying because, you know, one of the things I love in Star Trek and in science fiction is the stories themselves, you know, the main story. The B plot was always less interesting. If it was just about some minor character just doing something on the ship, just some kind of daily life of someone, because it was once in a while, it was interesting to see that. But if it's the entire show, if the whole show will be just about that and not those bigger stories, then I think the overall show will be less interesting. Like imagine that episode of TNG, The Lower Decks, which was interesting because it was so unique. But imagine if that was the whole show, if we never knew what the ship was doing, what the mission was, what's the main story about, and we only saw the daily life of the ship. I think it would be really boring if the whole show was just about that, because the main stories are the most interesting part. And so that's, I think, one of the problems, the potential problems of this new show. If the focus is just on the lower decks and we don't really know what the mission is, we don't see any epic stuff except somewhere in the background, then this might be less interesting actually. Even the tagline of the show kind of has me worried because the tagline is rarely going where no one went before. And that's kind of, I guess it's a little bit funny. And again, it depends on the style of comedy of the show. If it will be kind of a joke, if it's like a parody of the older Star Trek shows, maybe it will be funny, but it might be less interesting because I do want to see the ship encountering brand new things we didn't see before. And if they admit from the beginning that it's going to happen very rarely, and that most of the show, I guess, will be about the technical stuff on the ship, then I'm a little bit worried because the technical stuff is interesting on its own as well, but it's not as interesting as the main stories of what the bridge crew is doing and what the ship is doing in the normal Star Trek shows. That's the most interesting part usually, and especially the epic episodes in which there are some big stakes like saving the Federation, saving the timeline, saving the galaxy. Those were some epic stories which were interesting, but if we now only see it from the bowels of the ship, about the technicians doing the work while epic stuff is going on outside, which we barely get to see, it might be more boring this way. But I guess it all depends on how they do it. It might work. They might still make it interesting. They might involve all these junior officers in bigger stuff as well. Maybe they'll get promoted later. Maybe they'll take over the ship later. Maybe we will see directly all kinds of epic stuff. And so maybe we'll get enough of that stuff to keep it interesting as well. But it has the potential to just be boring. And I remember Gene Roddenberry was opposed to the idea of making a show about cadets. I think when they were first planning TNG, one of the ideas was to make it about a ship of cadets, of young people who were given command of a training ship or something like that. And Gene Roddenberry was very opposed to that idea. He wanted the show to be about, the best of humanity, about seasoned officers, about the best of the best, and having the ship do epic stuff, to be the spearhead, to be the flagship, to be the most important ship, and to show us all the epic stuff and the most interesting stories. And he opposed the idea of making a show about younger cadets running a ship. And so this kind of reminds me of that idea that he opposed to. But he opposed to a lot of stuff that was proven to be interesting later on. He did kind of put a lot of limitations which were problematic. So I'm never saying that Gene Roddenberry was perfect in everything he wanted. He did have a lot of brilliant ideas, and his vision was so brilliant and so inspiring and all of that. However, he did limit a writer's ability to make new kinds of stories and shake things up and so on. And especially since so many decades passed and so many different kinds of Star Trek shows exist already, I think it's okay now to do things differently, simply because you don't want to repeat the same exact stuff, the same exact formula. So I do think it's okay to try something totally different and to see things from a different perspective. It might be interesting. And so I don't want to prejudge this show. I don't want to condemn it before I see it. I do think it has potential. I hope it will be good, and I'll be doing reviews of it. So these are just my initial thoughts based on what I've seen so far. So let me know what you think, and we can discuss it in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video, please like, please subscribe, click the notification bell if you want to see updates of my new videos, and I will see you all next time. Bye bye.